Welcome everyone. I am Marianne Cosgrove, Acting Chair of Humanists Australia. Before we begin this session, I wish to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land and that sovereignty was never ceded. I wish to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I welcome any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. It's important that we remember whose land it is on which we tread, treat them respectfully as equals, and speak up when we see them suffering from injustice. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be made available to the public through the Humanists Australia YouTube channel and other media. Please keep your video camera off if you're concerned for your privacy. Today is the third day of Launchapalooza, a series of events celebrating the launch of the new national not-for-profit Humanists Australia. One of the four main goals of Humanists Australia is to support the formation and growth of inclusive, supportive humanist communities around Australia. Today is all about community. I'm very pleased to welcome Tim Hollo, Executive Director of the Green Institute, where he leads thinking around ecological political philosophy and practice and drives policy discussion around rights of nature, universal basic income, and participatory democracy. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Australian National University School of Regulation and Global Governance, RegNet, and is heavily involved in his local community. Amongst other things, establishing Canberra's first Buy Nothing groups, setting up a little free library, and spearheading local mutual aid in the early pandemic. He received almost a quarter of the vote, running as a Greens candidate for the seat of Canberra in the 2019 federal election. Tim was previously Communications Director for Greens leader Christine Milne and has been both a board member and a campaigner at Greenpeace Australia Pacific and has worked for 350, Lock the Gate and others. In 2013, he founded Green Music Australia, an organisation which brings together his environmental activism with his experience as a musician, having recorded 8 albums and toured nationally and globally, from the National Folk Festival to New York's Carnegie Hall with 4-place string quartet. Tim's writing on environmental, social and political issues has been widely published, including at the Griffith Review, Mean Gin, The Guardian, ABC, Arena, Fairfax and Crikey. He's currently completing a book on ecological politics. Please give a very warm welcome to Tim Hollo.
Thanks very much, Marianne. Very kind invitation and introduction. And thanks to everyone for coming along to this Launchapalooza at this busy time of this rather extraordinary year. I also want to start by acknowledging that we're meeting, albeit electronically, on stolen land. I'm joining the meeting from the unceded sovereign land of the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and still to come. I acknowledge their extraordinary stewardship of this land for countless generations and their systems of kinship across people and peoples, skin groups and species, understanding themselves to be connected and interdependent with everyone and everything else. There is so much that we have forgotten or that we have erased through genocide that we must relearn from the first peoples of this land, not least about the meaning of community and how to live in community with each other and with the natural world, which we are one small part of. So I was asked to speak to you today about the importance of community in these troubled times. And there's a couple of ways into that question. The basic path is simply to recognise that we humans are innately communal creatures. Like many other animals, we evolved to live in community and we find joy, strength, resilience in community, and most especially so in trying, troubling times. Our evolution as a communal creature was expressed beautifully by the great 19th century Russian scientist, ecologist and anarchist philosopher Peter Kropotkin in his famous work Mutual Aid. And it's worth quoting Kropotkin at length as we find our way into this question. He writes, "It is not love, and not even sympathy understood in its proper sense, which induces a herd of ruminants or of horses to form a ring in order to resist an attack of wolves. Not love which induces wolves to form a pack for hunting. Not love which induces kittens or lambs to play, or a dozen species of young birds to spend their days together in the autumn. And it is neither love nor personal sympathy which induces many thousand fallow deer scattered over a territory as large as France to form into a score of separate herds, all marching towards a given spot in order to cross there a river. It is a feeling infinitely wider than love or personal sympathy, an instinct that has been slowly developed among animals and humans in the course of an extremely long evolution, and which has taught animals and humans alike the force they can borrow from the practice of mutual aid and support, and the joys they can find in social life. It is not love and not even sympathy upon which society is based in humankind. It is the conscience, be it only at the stage of an instinct, of human solidarity. It is the unconscious recognition of the force that is borrowed by each person from the practice of mutual aid, of the close dependence of everyone's happiness upon the happiness of all, and of the sense of justice or equity, which brings the individual to consider the rights of every other individual as equal to their own. This instinct for mutual aid that Kropotkin sees at the core of what it is to be human, indeed what it is to be alive, is something I think we actually all feel all the time. Life is better when we're with friends, when we feel connected with the people we live amongst, when we can pop in on neighbours or just wave hello as we walk past. But the instinct is perhaps most obvious in difficult, troubled times. We see it in our society in the way people instinctually come together to help each other at times of emergency. During last summer's bushfires, with governments having vacated the space, people gathered to collect food and supplies for firefighters, to prepare meals for or even open their homes to those who'd lost everything, to knit boots and gloves for burned wildlife. And parenthetically, this is a fabulous example of how often we understand our community to extend to wildlife, to the more than human world. We see it when neighbours and families and friends gather round to support us when we've lost someone close, or if we're struggling to manage personal challenges. We see it in the way mutual aid groups sprang up everywhere as the COVID pandemic arrived, with people letterboxing their neighbours to offer support with everything from running errands to just calling for a chat. Now, with the year we've just had, the troubled times are pretty in your face. I don't need to remind you that 2020 started with our worst ever fires and choking smoke over our cities for weeks. And here in Canberra, we passed through an extraordinary hailstorm before we all moved swiftly into a global pandemic and the economic downturn it triggered. But it's too easy to make it about 2020 and forget the years that led us here. For a long time now, we've seen depression and anxiety rising. We've seen economic inequality spiraling out of control, with the billionaires and the politicians who serve them presiding over stagnating wages, job losses, worse quality of work, gig labour taking us right back to the days before unions won rights at work, and ever more punitive welfare systems like the cashless welfare card that our federal parliament just extended. We've seen the people increasingly excluded from participation in making the decisions that shape our future, with the delegitimisation of advocacy, the criminalisation of protest, while ministers' doors are wide open to corporate lobbyists. Corruption is seen as standard business practice, scientists are gagged, and whistleblowers prosecuted. We've seen the not unconnected rise of hate crimes, from graffiti on mosques and synagogues to horrific mass murders like in Christchurch. We've seen the rise of hate-filled politics, demagoguery that performs the classic bait and switch, grabbing hold of the very real disenchantment and disenfranchisement, and calling people together, but not to work together to create a better world. Instead, it brings them together as the mob, primed and ready, misdirecting anger away from the real causes and towards a convenient scapegoat they can punch down on instead of punching up. And hanging over it all is the ecological collapse that we can all feel in our bones. The heat, the fires and floods and storms, the extinctions, the death of river systems, the pandemics triggered by destruction of habitat, forcing animals into closer proximity with each other and with us, pushing diseases across species. And coronavirus brings it all into focus. Early in the pandemic, the great American legal and ecological scholar Jedediah Britton Purdy wrote, I think, the perfect one-sentence summary of the situation we find ourselves in. The new coronavirus, he writes, makes vivid the logic of a world that combines a material reality of intense interdependence with moral and political systems that leave people to look out for themselves. Interdependence versus alienation, the story of our world. A pandemic, more than almost any other phenomenon, shows that all our lives are inextricably intertwined, for now and forever, whether we like it or not just with other humans, but with other species we share this tiny, perfect planet with. We are only as healthy as the least healthy among us. Everything we do relies on extraordinary networks of activity by people we've never met and never will meet, crisscrossing the globe. A pandemic brings into sharp focus the impossibility of trying to keep economics, health, environment, education, and social justice treated as separate questions with separate answers. It shows how the efficient, on-demand world that capitalism has constructed is so incredibly fragile that a series of shocks can bring it to the point of collapse. It heightens awareness of our vital need as social beings to stay connected to each other as well as we possibly can, while keeping our physical distance. It proves that the culture of individualism is a myth, and a dangerous one at that. A pandemic brings home that these troubled times are the symptoms of a set of interconnecting crises, each of which in its own way is a crisis of disconnection. Disconnection from the natural world, pretending to ourselves that we are separate from nature and capable of controlling and dominating it. Disconnecting from each other in our mythology of individualism. Disconnection from our democratic systems. Disconnection from people from other countries or other ethnicities or other skin colours or other gender or sexuality. Patriarchy, colonialism, capitalism, pollution and resource extraction. These are all phenomena driven by disconnection and domination. It's what I think of as anti-ecological culture, a culture which reverses the deep understanding of diversity and interdependence that all ecosystems depend on, and that Peter Kropotkin reminds us is instinctual in all living creatures, and that is at the core, as I mentioned at the start, of Indigenous culture and governance. Indigenous political systems carefully suppress our worst instincts, selfishness, greed, the urge to domination, and institutionalize our best, cooperation, co-creation, mutual aid. Anti-ecological culture does the exact opposite. It institutionalizes our basest instincts and suppresses and erases our best. It invents the mythology of Homo economicus, the purely rational, selfish, self-maximizing individual, and it claims that any generous behavior must be either enlightened self-interest or virtue signaling, surely one of the most offensive slurs ever invented. It treats the whole world, the land we walk on, the water we drink, the creatures we share it with, and we ourselves, our bodies, our labor, our ideas, our emotions, as resources from which to extract value. It establishes economic systems based entirely on competition, and it creates political systems based on adversarialism, in both cases geared to defeating enemies, making cooperation a sign of weakness, erasing opportunities for cooperation and co-creation. And here's the point. From within these political and economic systems, we simply cannot face up to the interconnected crises of the 21st century. It's not that we need to fight harder, shout louder to convince those in power to act on the climate crisis, on Aboriginal deaths in custody, on intimate partner violence, economic inequality, hate crimes, on vindictive and punitive welfare systems, and so much more. The systems we are working within created these crises. They are not capable of addressing them. They're designed to shut out the community, to concentrate power as firmly as possible in as few hands as possible. What's worse, these systems are spectacularly ill-suited to enabling human survival in the far less hospitable world that they've created. In the years ahead, as climate disruption worsens, as ecological collapse introduces more pandemics into human society, as food supplies teeter, as desperate governments lean more towards authoritarianism to hold on to control, Systems based on adversarialism, individualism, narrow efficiency, primacy of money and brute force will only increase the chaos. They only make human extinction, taking with us so much of the precious and beautiful diversity of life on this planet, more likely. But the thing is, the current systems are failing. It's increasingly clear as authoritarians undermine democracies, as massive monopolies undermine capitalist competition, as the Black Lives Matter movement brings cities to their knees and people around the globe find and invent new democratic spaces. The old world is dying, and the new is struggling to be born. What if we took the failure of these systems as an opportunity to reinvent them? What if we said the age of disconnection is over, it's reached its logical conclusion, and the age of consequences is here? The only possible option to us left is to rediscover and reinstitutionalize connection as the basis for our society. So the second, deeper way into the question of the importance of community in these troubled times is how we can find in community the path to better times. Our challenge is to respond not just to the symptoms, to the crises as they confront us directly, to reduce pollution, to confront racism, to support those in need, to oppose the rise of authoritarianism and defend democracy. Our real challenge is to confront the circumstances that create these crises. And the solution to both is the same. The journey is the destination. We need to cultivate more networks of support, more social cohesion, more layers of redundancy, so when one safety net fails, another several remain, more cooperation and generosity. And through such community building, we can rebuild our political and economic systems around interdependent diversity. In that way, we can learn how not just to survive, but to thrive. Now, there's a tremendous amount to dig into here. I'm currently, as Marianne said, writing a book on these ideas and could talk, unfortunately, for days. So I want to just take one central idea and dig around that specifically in the time remaining, and we can discuss that and more in the conversation part of this session. And that idea is how we make community central to democracy, because it isn't right now. In Australia, we have a remarkable franchise, broader and more reliable and trustworthy than almost anywhere else in the world. But I sometimes wonder if our brilliant voting system hasn't distracted us from the fact that our avenues for democratic participation in other ways, from consultation to lobbying, whistleblowing to protest, are increasingly constrained. But even that is far too narrow a view of democracy, still characterising it as a mechanism for the people to seek to influence the state as an institution separate from us, rather than the people coming together to jointly make decisions about our common future and to build that future together. Elections and representative democracy, which emerged as a compromise extracted from monarchs to give more people some semblance of a say, are not the be-all and end-all. Liberal republics like the USA simply replicated this compromise, constructing systems to keep the great unwashed from having too great a say. Although in large, complex systems, some degree of representation will always remain necessary, the basic unit of democracy must be the people themselves acting together with a diversity of voices in a diversity of spaces. The basic practice then must be participation. True democracy is not handing responsibility to a select few. Neither is it nobody having responsibility. That's libertarianism. Nor is it everyone having responsibility only for themselves. In a deep ecological democracy, everybody has responsibility for their part of the interconnected whole. Understood in this participatory way, democracy enables everyone to have agency in their own lives. By making democracy about community, we can bring out our best. And Frances Moore Lappé describes this idea beautifully. She says, let's acknowledge what's more and more obvious, that our idea of democracy is just way too weak for the job. Then we can get on with the work of bringing to life an emergent, more powerful understanding of democracy that does work, because it's creating a context that reflects what is now clear about human nature. our capacity for cruelty when power is too concentrated, secrecy prevails and scapegoating ensues, as well as under the opposite conditions, our capacity for fairness and cooperation as we leave behind the status of whiners and blamers and share in power as doers and creators. How do we make that vision a reality? I think it starts with connection, with cultivating community, cultivating participatory democracy in our daily lives, in our communities, in spaces that matter to us, developing positive experiences, and then parlaying that into more capital D democracy. One of the signal successes of anti-ecological culture is that it's turned us off democracy. It's treated us, it's distracted us from it by keeping us busy and convinced us to ignore it as irrelevant, uninteresting, a game for the powerful to play at our expense. If we're to counter that, democratic participation has to be fulfilling, enjoyable, dare I say it, even fun. It has to be about what people are passionate about. And that's why making its basic unit the level closest to the action is vital, because people get involved and stay involved when they can have an influence on things that really matter to them. Often the entry point will be placemaking activities like planning issues, land care, local schools, things which give people a sense of belonging. But being closest to the action doesn't have to be geographically local. Sometimes, especially in our technologically interconnected world, they can be geographically dispersed communities of interest, co-governing anything from a political party or advocacy group to a fan club or broadcasting organisation. But the connection has to be clear and direct. Making participation the core of our democracy can, on one level, be seen as radical restructuring of our democratic institutions. And over time it will be. But part of its beauty is that it can and actually must be cultivated through evolution from the grassroots up. It can't be imposed from on high. It starts by expanding the democratic space, reclaiming the commons, and building positive experiences of democratic participation for people so that they come to enjoy and respect democracy. Then that flourishing community democratic space can become an effective political space. This is all a bit theoretical, so let me give you a few fantastic examples. One of the gentlest and subtlest, but no less effective examples of this approach is the Participatory City program in London's borough of Barking, which I was lucky enough to visit in 2017. At its most basic level, the program supports communities to develop their own urban commons projects, from cooking co-ops to knitting groups, pop-up shops to tool libraries, parent support groups to community gardens. They have drop-in centres on high streets, staffed with people who can assist locals to find ways to participate or set up new ones if they want, and navigate their way through tricky local government processes and interpersonal relationships. They're doing this partly because of what each project brings, but largely because of the overarching benefits across the community. They've already found that these projects reduce a range of social ills, from homelessness to drug addiction to family violence, by making people across the area feel included and valued, have more agency in their lives. One of the reasons they chose Barking was because the combination of poverty and ethnic diversity had seen a terrifying rise in far-right politics and racist attacks. Both have dropped since the project took off. Participatory City is doing democracy differently. It's not public, not private, not paternalistic, but participatory. It's cultivating democratic space outside politics, and by doing so, changing politics. A more directly political example is Barcelona en Comú, the cooperative-led municipal government of Barcelona, which I was also privileged to visit on my 2017 travels, meeting key members and learning about their approach. The genesis of the project was the extraordinary community response to the 2008 economic crash, which hit Spain among the hardest in the world, partly thanks to their government's drastic austerity policies. Millions took to the streets in protest, millions, and stayed there, starting the movement of the squares, with self-organising mutual aid projects and community assemblies. The latter swiftly became the political project Podemos, which never really took off in a big way. But in Barcelona, they built a different approach by focusing primarily on practical participatory projects, from health cooperatives to squatters support networks childcare cooperatives to food sharing networks, actively ensuring that everyone in the community had what they needed to survive when government had abandoned them. Only after that was well underway did people involved in those groups come together with a municipal election approaching and begin to craft a political strategy, seeing the government as a key obstacle to be removed. They democratically developed a code of political ethics that they agreed to be bound by, elected housing activist Ada Colau as their spokesperson, and ran for election as Barcelona en Comú, Barcelona in Common. They won minority government with Greens and other left-wing parties, and Colau as mayor. From there, they began to institutionalise the changes they were making on the ground, from legitimising squats to seizing back control of the water supply, which had been privatised, to handing as many decisions as possible back to the community. As one of their advisors, Francesca Bria, told me, sometimes it's better not to regulate, not to govern, but to enable autonomous self-government. Despite tremendous struggles, Barcelona en Comú was re-elected for a second 4-year term in 2019. We've got some fantastic examples in Australia too, exploring this kind of space. And I just want to outline 2 of them that I love. The first is an organisation called The Next Economy, led by my friend Dr. Amanda Carl, bringing direct democracy to regions in economic transition out of fossil fuels. Having grown up in regional Queensland and trained as an ethnographical researcher, Amanda is able to work in these communities when invited in ways which bring people together to create positive visions which sound like they're lifted straight out of Green's wish lists. For Amanda, the key is bringing democratic conversations into people's everyday lives, rather than leaving it to the abstractions and tribalisms of contemporary politics. As she told me, the more you can narrow it down into time and place, the more real and useful and practical a conversation you're going to have. The further away you get from that, the more people have to identify with a position without any context around it. By inviting people to sit down together and think about the strengths of their communities and what they can bring to the table, and by giving examples of what other communities in similar circumstances are doing, Amanda helps people to find their own hope and then to activate it. She effectively midwives the birth of projects from community-owned renewable energy cooperatives to catering cooperatives for unemployed young people to arts and tourism initiatives in places like the Hunter Valley and Gladstone. And she shows government representatives who take part in the sessions that transition doesn't have to be scary. It can be joyful, creative, and fun. Critically, Amanda's work puts the lie to the cynical belief of a lot of progressives and environmentalists that we can't trust people enough to really rely on democracy. It demonstrates that when you invite people to participate in decision-making, most of us genuinely want the same things. The second Australian example is Voices for Indi, the community-driven participatory politics project, which has led to the election of community delegates to the federal parliament. Around the town of Wangaratta, the regional Victorian electorate of Indi has been represented for generations by Conservative politicians. And for several terms, it had been represented by a hard right MP, increasingly out of step with her constituents. A group of community members decided to hold a series of kitchen table conversations in order to gather a set of agreed community values, as well as a political vision for the region. This deep community engagement built trust and cohesion to the extent that when it came time to select a representative to run for Parliament, not only did the first candidate have tremendous support and win twice, but when she chose to stand down, her successor was easily elected as well. This is thanks to ongoing community engagement, inviting community members to actively participate in setting the agenda for their MP, work in her office, and help shape her decisions. Voices for Indi is an extraordinary example of an MP within our existing top-down hierarchical system truly working as a bottom-up delegate of the community in a way which, if replicated broad scale, could play a tremendous role in devolving power and reshaping the state. These are far from the only examples. Latin America is full of amazing projects pioneered through the economic crashes of the late 20th century, often combining community mutual aid with workers taking control of factories and businesses which were closing their doors in a process they call recuperation. This developed into a political approach called horizontalidad, horizontalism, which is built on decision-making by the group for the group, connecting on an equal level with other groups operating in the same manner. It's worth just taking the opportunity to note the crucial space of workplace democracy that recuperation is a prime example of. There's no reason why businesses have to be top-down hierarchies focused purely on making profit for executives and shareholders. As we seek to build community-based democracy, we should similarly do the same for economic systems through cooperatives, community ownership, local currencies, and informal economic projects like repair cafes, swap meets, and buy nothing groups. But that would be a whole several hours of extra conversation. What do all these ideas have in common? Connection, weaving networks of interdependence, dissolving dominating power by ensuring that we all have agency together to act together as autonomous, interdependent beings. Community. Before I finish up and we move to discussion, I do want to dig just a little bit deeper into the question of how we can actually institutionalize these community-based democratic systems. The Barcelona en Comú approach is one path, building local community systems and then parlaying that effort into electoral success. I'd genuinely love to see that kind of idea merged with the Voices for Indi approach here in Australia. Deep community building intertwined with electoral politics. But there's one truly remarkable example I want to discuss, and that's the autonomous administration of North and Eastern Syria, also known as Rojava. Rojava sprang from the Kurdish independence movement, which for decades had been a Maoist revolutionary movement, finding very little success. Their leader, Abdullah Öcalan, imprisoned in Turkey, came across the work of the brilliant American Jewish post-anarchist philosopher Murray Bookchin on municipal confederalism. Now, Bookchin grew up a communist, became an anarchist, was always an environmentalist, and in middle age, disenchanted with mainstream anarchism's out-of-hand rejection of any form of government as problematically statist, decided to develop some structures that could formalize community-based democracy without falling into the trap of becoming a top-down hierarchical state. The core of Bookchin's model is small-scale community assemblies, where every single member of the community has the opportunity to be involved in decision-making, have their voice heard and respected, and take part in implementing decisions made through consensus in those assemblies. But Bookchin was very aware of the danger of localism in disconnecting communities from each other and sowing the seeds of division. So each assembly sends delegates, not representatives, delegates who can be recalled at any time to regional councils, whose task it is to share ideas, to work together to implement larger scale projects, but not to make decisions. Those rest at the community level. Öcalan, very taken with this idea, sent it back to his compatriots, who set about actually making it happen. City block by city block, rural area by rural area, community by community. It's working. Rojava is an extraordinary example of municipal confederalism in action. Decision-making remains with the people in around 4,000 now local assemblies of its 2 million citizens, coordinated through confederal councils for each 7 to 10 assemblies and an overarching confederal layer over the whole body. Each assembly and council operates through consensus, coordinated by co-chairs of whom at least one has to be a woman. In this way, Rojava survives among the wreckage of the semi-failed states of Syria and Iraq, threatened constantly by the USA, Russia, Turkey, and ISIS. And not only is it surviving, but it's thriving, expanding well beyond Kurds, embracing multi-ethnic communities, moving into new areas with far greater success than a Maoist insurgency ever could, by replacing revolution at the point of a gun with building community, bringing people together, giving them agency, making life better. We may not eventually want to replicate Rojava's dramatic reinvention of democratic systems, or we may, but the vision of community-based democracy is, I think, something that the vast majority of us can get behind. And there are so many paths in that direction, a different path for each community, paths that we have to make by walking them together. whether it's through urban agriculture projects, growing food together in our backyards or street verges, or whether it's by putting together renewable energy cooperatives so that we can communally own the climate-friendly source of our power, whether it's through proactive participatory democratic planning in our neighbourhoods, where we come together to decide what we want in our neighbourhood and then go to governments and developers instead of us having to respond to what they want. Or whether it's walking school buses or pandemic-ready mutual aid, anything that cultivates connection, builds community, and finds ways to institutionalise them, build them into how we make decisions together. As we organise in our communities, cultivate social cohesion, build experience with deep democratic participation, we'll start to shift the centre of gravity of political power towards the community. We'll begin to dissolve the dominating power that relies on keeping us divided, and will distribute that power evenly across the community so everyone has agency. Community making is who we are. It's what we evolved to do with our instinct for mutual aid. All we have to do is set that instinct free, and it will be our path out of these troubled times. Thank you.
Everyone, please give Tim a warm round of applause for his wonderful talk. Thank you, Tim. I might kick off the questions, if I may, by asking one myself. Humanist Australia is a new organisation, and one of our goals is to set up and help support new and growing communities around Australia. Do you have any advice for how we might achieve growth in the community space? How we might set up systems and encourage people to come together?
I think the best advice I can give is to always seek to make it enjoyable. I think that's a critical part of the picture that we often forget when we're setting up kind of groups or systems of decision making together. Is to seek to find the joy and the fun in it, because it really can be. And when we bury that in layers of kind of bureaucracy, or when we feel it's becoming a chore, that's when things start to get difficult very often. And if people start to resent the fact that they've been left to carry the can, in some cases, and others aren't helping out, we need to make these processes fun. And I think the way we do that is to always, bring something else to the conversation. And to me, one of the most obvious is food. It so often happens that way. A meeting is so much better when there's nice food at the table and you can just sit and eat together. But it might be kind of combining meetings with performances, getting a bit of music in there or something.
It's funny you should say that, because we've got our community dinners tonight, and at our launch on Thursday night, International Human Rights Day, we had Franciscus Henry give us a musical interlude.
Yeah, I mean, so this is the thing. It's instinctive, isn't it? Like, we know this stuff. We really do. But the systems, as kind of inherited by us, and as the system tries to impose on us, kind of saps the fun out of it so much of the time. And in that context, we have to always kind of remember to bring it back. I guess the other thing I'd say is, and I know that this is what you're talking about as well, but the idea of there's different ways of envisaging growth, aren't there? Very different ways. And I think the Rojava example is an amazing one, where basically they started just by kind of self-organizing in their own communities. And what they found is that it was working so well that people in the communities around them just wanted to copy their example. They just wanted to get involved and do the same kind of thing. And they sort of had ambassadors going out and helping people and showing them how it worked, so that it sort of, it grows like a garden, rather than growing like a cancer cell, which is what capitalism is designed to do, and eat everything in its path. So yeah, it's about supporting others to find their own path into this. rather than going out and trying to conquer and colonize new areas.
Let's open the floor to other questions for Tim. I will watch for hands. You can either put your hand up in the video, or if you go to the participants panel, you can use the button there to put your hand up. When I see your hand, I'll acknowledge it in the chat, or I'll say something. Les, I see you. Would you like to kickstart with your question, Les?
Thanks for a very interesting and engaging talk, Tim. Your talk raised so many questions for me. I have some friends who are socialists and eco-socialists, so I'm really fascinated by these kinds of discussions about getting, and they're about decentralizing power as well. Look, my first question is, we have community-based organisations like U3A and other special interest groups where people get engaged for their personal satisfaction. But you're talking about real social and political engagement. And I'm thinking, and I know people who have got no interest. They're interested in joining little groups that satisfy their personal interests, but they're not interested in social movements, and they're not interested, certainly not interested in political engagement. So I'm thinking you need a critical mass of people. It might be 20%, 30, 50, 70% of the local population to be engaged to actually have any real results. So what do you think about what that critical mass is, and would that critical mass vary from situation to situation or society to society?
So many things to respond to there. In terms of that specific question, the one study that I can think of that is highly relevant to that, or set of studies that's highly relevant to that question, suggests that the critical mass is actually a lot smaller than one might think, although it's not specifically on that. And that is the work of Erica Chenoweth, who's a scholar of nonviolence, who's studied at great length and in great detail the capacity for nonviolent movements to overthrow oppressive systems of government. And she's demonstrated through that work that actually nonviolent movements are at least 2 to 3 times as successful as violent movements, and like 7 or 8 times as successful as terrorist movements. And that their success relies on the fact that nonviolent movements involve a lot more people in the process and bring a lot more people into confident engagement with the process. And the number that she has calculated is that the tipping point is when 3.5% of the population get involved on an ongoing basis. 3.5% of the population of any kind of jurisdiction properly, not just kind of once turning out to a protest, but properly engaged ongoing in movements of civil disobedience and kind of reconstruction, is enough to tip the balance and lead to, you know, the overthrow of authoritarian regimes. That suggests to me, in answer to your specific question, that actually the number of people who need to be engaged kind of on an ongoing basis in this kind of decision making is actually relatively small. But that must never become you know, a priesthood. You know, it must never become a separate body who are the ones who govern and that nobody else governs. It's got to be a kind of a flow. And in that sense, I think the fact that a lot of people do like getting involved in things like U3A or, you know, little community associations or gardening, you know, groups. There's so many community gardens and things like that around Canberra. We need to see those as also part of the democratic process, actually, because they are. If we take the center of gravity of our politics out from the abstraction that it mostly sits at and down to the community level and say, this is fundamentally where we come together to decide our common path, being part of a community garden or a U3A group or whatever is part of that democratic practice too. And once people see that and start to engage in it and do that, and if we make those more kind of specific governing practices and groups more fun to be part of too, then I think we'll see more people getting involved.
I was muted. I was pressing the space bar. Normally that lets me speak. I gather no one heard me then. Dave is next.
Okay. Thanks again, Tim, for a great presentation. Not only because it was also nice to hear views of which I accord so much to, in the sense that I've always railed against the assumption that hierarchy is inevitable and the only way to get something done is a rigid hierarchy with someone in charge. So I suppose my question is along those lines. At the basis of something like a nation state or bigger, how far can we go to flattening the hierarchical pyramid, in your view? Can we do away with the presidents and prime ministers? And what's the theoretical limit to something that's democratic, but will have inevitably a certain amount of hierarchy just because people are better at some things and it's impractical to have everyone deciding on everything? But hopefully you could have something much more consultative. And what sort of timescale do you feel you could accomplish that ideally?
Timescale is a big question. My view is that there should be no limit to it. And I'm kind of, the book that I'm writing specifically kind of takes this question of anti-ecological thinking and ecological thinking and describes the politics based on ecological thinking. And there's been this idea in political thought forever, for thousands of years, that there's a limit to scale, and you kind of, scale is this fundamental question of, if you want to have participation, there's only so many people who can be involved, and therefore you need to have some form of hierarchy and domination.
Yes.
Ecologies don't work that way. On an ecological level, there is no hierarchy. There are the human body is an ecosystem in its own right, but it's fundamentally interconnected with everybody else's ecosystem. There's catchments, there's continent-wide ecosystems, there's global ecosystems, and you can't at any stage kind of point to anything in any scale of that ecosystem and say this is the dominant one. There's no reason it needs to work like that. Scale simply in an ecological way is about interconnection and interdependence. So there certainly is a fair amount of study that shows that the ideal kind of number for people actively participating themselves in decision-making processes can't get much more than, say, 150 to 200. So for those base political groups of participation, you don't want to get much larger than that. But then you kind of agglomerate. And as long as you have these systems of interdependence and cross-fertilization, as long as you keep the decision-making local, there's no reason why it can't build to a global level, particularly with the technology that we have now. There's absolutely no reason.
Yes, the technology.
Technology enables that. In terms of the timescales, goodness, I mean, tipping points move incredibly fast when they're reached. And it feels to me very much like we are on the cusp of the collapse of the current systems. And one of the reasons I think why Rojava works so well is because they were building almost from nothing. Like, there was no active government in that space. So they were able to kind of create a new space of government. And I suspect that that's going to start happening very, very fast for goodness sake, look at the United States of America. I mean, it's easy, in my opinion, to imagine that the USA will not exist in this current form in a decade's time, and who knows what could replace it. So yeah, conscious of the time, and there's a few more questions, and I hope that's a sufficient answer.
I was just about to say, Tim, is there any chance you could stay on a little longer, or do you need to go promptly at 11?
No, I can stay for a few more minutes, yeah.
Thank you. I have Sue next.
Thank you, and thanks, Tim, for a fantastic talk. You provided a lot of examples of where community is being built around the world that I wasn't aware of. So I've sort of been making a few notes to look them up and find out more. So thank you. I was curious to know whether or not you've had any connection with a number of the other developments that are happening around the world. For many years, I've been involved in the Global Appreciative Inquiry community, which is less a process and more a way of seeing the world. And the principles you're talking about seem to be very much underpinning a lot of the work there. I had the privilege of visiting some village banks in the Terai, southern part of Nepal, a few years ago. And there's an amazing story about how, and again, it was using sort of an adapted AI process to empower the women there to set up their village banks. I won't go on too long because there are other people wanting to ask you questions. And also the mention of music being important. Have you come across Playing for Change?
Yes.
Which is another that I was just curious as to whether you'd had any connection with either some of the AI practitioners or with Playing for Change sort of work around the world.
I'm aware of AI, but I haven't been directly connected with them. There's a range of, from permaculture-based conversation groups to asset-based community development.
Yes.
All sorts of things like that. The work around commons
yes.
and commoning similarly. I just happen to have on my desk right in front of me actually this amazing book. I don't know if you're aware of that, Take Back the Economy.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
By J.K. Gibson Graham and co, which goes into a whole lot of detail on that. Look, there's so many examples. And on the music front, I set up this little organisation, Green Music Australia, a few years ago, and so I was Playing for Change on that basis, and Reverb and others in America. And this is what gives me hope to go back to the next point, is that wow, there's so much going on at the moment. There's so much awareness that the current system is shit and is driving us towards extinction. And as that starts to collapse, it's what Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci basically said. This is a point of interregnum, as he puts it, when the old world is dying and the new is struggling to be born. And it's an extraordinarily dangerous moment. We could head towards full fascism quite easily. But the alternative is that we just build these systems from the grassroots up.
Thank you.
I have Melissa next.
Hi, Tim. That was a great talk. There were a couple of things I wanted to say, and probably the most important is, obviously you put a lot of work into this talk. Have you already thought about how you would like to publish that so that it can be available for more people? A second thing was that was mentioned earlier about people in the past who haven't wanted to join and contribute to groups for like socially progressive things. And I think that's because they learned early in life that idealistic groups didn't affect change in their daily life. So they learned that doesn't work. So if you start with something very small and local where they can see a specific thing that they're interested in could have a direct and immediate impact, then they will unlearn that previous learned passive behavior. So I think it's a learnable thing.
Couldn't agree
and I wanted to give one little example that I've heard of, which was there are many people who have rare diseases, orphan diseases or uncommon diseases, and they form groups mainly to give information to each other. Someone who's been to 10 different medical specialists and finally found something that works wants to tell other people to help them shorten their journey. And then they start becoming advocacy groups, especially if like treatment's unaffordable or the wrong harmful treatment's been given to people, etc. But I read about one such group and someone was commenting that one of the people in the group was a well-off white woman, and she had some fairly conservative ideological views, and she got this rare disease, and she ended up in a rare disease group where one of the leaders of the group was poor black guy, and they had this disease in common. And if she wanted to make any progress in this group, she had to shed all that, because the person who was doing the most was this guy. So she had to change. So I think very specific and narrow things can be tools for a much wider change.
Absolutely, absolutely.
But yeah.
Couldn't agree more. I think there's so many examples of that kind of thing where, where the personal becomes political, as the feminist slogan had it 40, 50 years ago. And it's through that we learn so much. And yeah, I think that's absolutely central to the path to change.
Can we have the text of your talk, or are you going to publish it somewhere that we can read it?
Yes. Yes.
Is it going in your book?
I expect you can have the text of this talk, but
there's copyright issues.
The book is very much going into these issues in great detail. Not too great detail. I'm hoping it'll still be quite a digestible scale book, and I am working my guts out to try to finish the manuscript. I was supposed to finish it by the end of this year. It's not going to be finished by the end of this year. This year has just been insane. But it'll be finished by the beginning of March, in which case it'll be published mid next year. But there's a bunch of things. If you go to the Green Institute's website, there's a bunch of things that I've published already on the website that go into very much the same questions. And probably the piece that this digs most around in is an essay that was in Arena magazine earlier this year, which I called "There's No Time Left Not to Do Everything." So that'd be a good one to look at. But yeah, the book.
This specific talk has been recorded, and I will be making it available through the Humanists Australia website and our YouTube channel. I will be sending a link to all of our members and people on our mailing lists to that YouTube channel after Launchapalooza has finished.
Great, yeah. So yes.
Rod, I see your hand.
Yeah. So Melissa, yes, you'll be able to watch it again, as I will. Thanks very much, Tim. Inspirational. Mine, I don't know whether you'll be able to answer this, but maybe you can point me somewhere, or maybe it's something for us to, as a Humanists Australia, to talk to you about ongoing. We've spent a lot of time this year putting together a set of platforms and ideas and values and everything else, getting us to this point. And our aim, as we've talked about over and over, is to support the growth of humanist communities, which could be all the sorts of communities you've mentioned. They might take all different sorts of forms, anything from a humanist garden club to a protest movement. Yeah. I'm getting tired of spending my time on bureaucracy and would love to be doing some of those groups. How do you make that transition without dropping the important work that I think we're doing in setting up those platforms? Obviously, I mean, the answer is to see other people kicking off those little groups all over the place, but how do you find them and get it happening?
This is just one of the constant questions, isn't it? You need more people, and yeah, you do need that critical mass, which links back to that earlier question. Just as as a couple of examples from my own life, as I said, I've set up this little organisation, Green Music Australia, as an organisation for musicians to kind of help lead the way to a greener world. And I started it by just asking kind of a dozen of my friends whether they'd be involved in some ways, and some of them started and picked some of them would pick up some work and some of them wouldn't, and then others came in, and it really takes quite some time, as I'm sure you're all very well aware, to bring enough people in who are committed enough to actually want to take on some of the jobs and start doing things. And I guess the point from that, and the other example that I'm going to give, is that success breeds success. And when you demonstrate that you're actually doing something which is not necessarily, and success has different definitions. If you're doing something which looks like it's fun, and people will want to join and take on things as part of it. But if you're making change as well, then that encourages people even more. And yeah, I was going to raise the example of the ACT Greens, which has really moved in peaks and troughs over the last few years, as many political parties do, of course, but a small and newish political party does so more so, and it's more dramatic when it does. So we had a bit of a trough after the 2012 election when we had 4 members of the Legislative Assembly. We went down to 1. Took quite a while to rebuild, and a lot of volunteers kind of left the party, and a lot of people who'd been in core roles left the party. And we'd been rebuilding quite well over the last few years, but we still had a smallish number of people involved in kind of actually willing to take on the key roles of convener and treasurer and secretary and sit on campaign teams and all of that kind of stuff, because there's so many volunteer roles across a political party and so few paid roles, like 2. And since the ACT election, where we elected 6 MLAs and suddenly have 3 ministers in the government and a huge amount of say, we've had a massive increase in membership of the local party, and like a 30% increase over the last month. And a whole lot of people, new members and old members actually wanting to take part and taking on new roles. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot over the last few months is how we really cultivate that and ensure that there's a pathway for people to follow. So if you join the party just because you want to take part in the campaigns, fine. If you join the party because you actually really like policy discussions and you want to really dig into that, then we'll find a pathway for you to be involved in policy conversations and help out in different ways. If you actually really like organizational stuff, hey, come and help out, and we'll find a pathway for you to get involved more. And so to really kind of try to institutionalize in those processes. Yes, you're involved in the organizational structure at this stage and you really want to get your hands dirty and get gardening. Okay, well, you go and get gardening, and when you're talking to people as you're gardening, the other people in that little group, find out if people, in that have any particular interest in I don't know, what bookkeeping or facilitating meetings or whatever, or somebody who seems to have some skills, cultivate those skills. And, I think that's how these things work really well, is if everyone is always looking out for each other and looking out for the different ways that other people around them are contributing and can contribute more, and encourage and enable them to do so. And that's how it balloons.
That's one of the points of Humanists Australia, really, is to take on that burden of bureaucracy and free everyone else around the country from it. And in fact, just this week, the ACT Humanist Society members voted to close down their legal society and become a supported community of Humanists Australia, which frees up our treasurer, the convener, myself. It frees us up from those bureaucratic requirements. But yes, we still do need a core group of people who are willing to take on those functions at the national level. But we take on that burden in order to free up everyone else.
And the critical thing, and I'm sure you're thinking about this, the critical thing is to, and this is one of the reasons why I think actually kind of these different scales, and each of the different scales actually still having their own bureaucracy in a sense is important, because you need to build skills in people so that they can take on those roles. I've seen it too often happen that you get a confederation happening and the lower levels of the confederation kind of start to lose their skills as the higher levels take on more, and you don't have a pathway for people to build more skills and get more involved.
We do have one piece of infrastructure that I think is really critical for this, which is the Slack messaging system. We've got a Slack workspace with multiple channels where people can communicate across the nation really easily. And we have channels set up for interest groups and for communities and for volunteering. So we can start to form those interest groups and communities, give them an opportunity to build and chat there, and to organise in face-to-face ways as well. We're also planning to set up a volunteering roster, a list of people who are looking for volunteer workers who are willing to help out, and a list of tasks that need to be done and roles that need to be performed so that we can cross-coordinate.
Excellent.
So we better wrap it up there. We're over time, but please, everyone, again, put your hands together for Tim. It's been a wonderful talk, wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for coming. That concludes this morning's Launchapalooza session. Next up, we have a casual chat over lunch in this same Zoom link from 12:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time. At 2 p.m, there'll be a panel session featuring humanist community leaders. And tonight there will be in-person dinners in Adelaide, Brisbane, Canberra, Melbourne, and Sydney. Some of these are now closed for RSVPs, but some may be able to take extras. If you haven't RSVP'd yet but would like to come, please email me at mac@humanistaustralia.org. Also, if you can't make it to one of those locations, there is an online dinner hosted by Sue James in this same Zoom link. Tomorrow is Activism Day. I hope to see you at one of our upcoming sessions. The full schedule is available on our website, humanistaustralia.org. Thank you again, Tim, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks for having me.